Hey everybody, thanks for coming to SCSP. A lot of friendly faces, a lot of friends of SCSP. It's always good to have Eric here in town. Um, Sorry we were late a little bit because we're coming out of another meeting. Eric, thank you for coming. Good to have you here as always. This is the recording of the first episode of our new podcast, but there was no better time than actually talking about your new book, Genesis. And I told you in the car, but I'm going to share with the audience here. But the way I prepared for this interview, I asked Gemini Advanced to go into YouTube and pull all Eric's recent interviews about the book and pull the questions he received and buckle them in different threads. And it's amazing. It's amazing. Like I got 7 categories of questions that I have to ask, or Eric was asked. So I'm trying not to repeat some of the questions. Obviously, next week marks 6 years since I started working for you, and I've been in a lot of meetings, both classified and unclassified with you. But there are 2 stories that always intrigue me when you tell them that I would like you to share with the audience. Number one is Kissinger's reaction when you brought him to Google for the first time, and the second one is the AlphaGo in South Korea.
So Ylli, first, congratulations for building this extraordinary group. And you're always kind to give other people credit, but you'd built it. And you worked with Dr. Kissinger before his death to be inspired by what he did in the Rockefeller Commission way back when. So the first question was,
how you convinced Kissinger to visit Google?
Well, I had met him at a Bilderberg conference, which is a strange conference of old people. And he looked at me and he said, how does Google work and why are the results so bad? That's his, in his German accent. And I explained it to him. I didn't like the explanation, so I invited him to Google. So he shows up, and this is in 2008. And he stands up in front of the entire company. He announces that Google is a threat to civilization. And everyone at Google loved it because all of a sudden they became more important. I think today, in that story, you see that he foresaw what we're seeing now with the impact of social media and AI, all of the issues around the tech companies in that one narrative.
The other, I think, answer that always is interesting is obviously you went with Dem Sasabi in South Korea, AlphaGo, remarkable moment, I think, in human history. And so for those of you that have not watched, it's a great documentary. But also, I know you were a force behind executing that.
So in Korea, so what had happened was we had bought DeepMind. And this is a little startup of very smart people who talked a really good game. And this was before we really understood the power of AI. This is before language models. And so I figured that I should go and watch the game. So what happens is it's in the Four Seasons in Seoul, perfectly nice. They have all the cables and so forth. And you have all the humans, right, and all the Koreans. And the Koreans are all organized in their rooms. And they're all very big Go players. And they're extremely confident. And then you have the engineers in their little room with the control panel. And I'm going like, it's the 5 of them against the 500 Koreans. And the Koreans this is like it. This is like combat. And so there are roughly 3 games. And the first game, it was clear that the human made a mistake, right? And everyone said, well, he'll correct it. But in the second game, as I remember, there was a move which is called the move 37 in the game where the Koreans went crazy because this move made no sense at all. And they were convinced that DeepMind would lose. The human would win. And, there's a perfectly nice human who's all 23 years old, who's like brilliant at playing Go. And so what happens is they take the move. So I'm with the Koreans because, I'm doing subtle diplomacy. So I go talk to the humans on the Korean side and they say, they're a disaster. So I go into the lab where they're actually doing it. And they said, here's how we run the game. We're really optimizing we're basically making sure that our probability of winning is always greater than 50%. So as long as our probability is always greater than 50%, we always win. And that moved the probability because the computer could see a move that had never been invented in 2,500 years. ultimately we won and the Koreans were destroyed and all that. And that was a big deal. Subsequently, we did the same thing in China, near Shanghai. And same thing, arguably a better player in China than in Korea. We have the first game, it's going okay. Then in the second game, it's clear that our algorithm is working. And guess what? The Chinese turn off the television. There were 300 million people watching of some kind, so that the Chinese could not see their own defeat, which we ultimately did. After that, Google retired the play. There was no reason to keep going. And that team ultimately became the team that invented AlphaFold, which is the 200 million proteins for the human bodies, which got the leaders the Nobel Prize. So it's a really nice story. You start in games, like who cares about Go? Well, an awful lot of people in Asia care about Go. But more importantly, all of that, the tree structures that were invented and so forth, were then used to do something really important for humanity.
For the last 6 years, every time you talk about AI, you've always said, to us at least, we're at the beginning of the beginning. And I think that Genesis really captures that sentiment. And we have a video here from SCSP that ends with your quote that says, development of alternative intelligence will be, I think, quoting precisely you, something new in human history. And so just to deep dive a little bit on Genesis, we wrote it this is Dr. Kissinger's last book. I've been on some of the sessions you were working on. Where did the idea come from? Why Genesis?
Well, we had written our first book together right before ChatGPT, and we got most of it right, and we featured GPT-3, but we did not, because it hadn't happened yet, understand that what a ChatGPT moment was. Remember, that was only 2 years ago. Just think about it. Right? It was only 2 years ago. And so the book was out, and so we thought we should update it, and this produced this argument. And Genesis is really about what happens when you have polymaths in people's pockets. It's really what happens when this alien intelligence shows up next to each and every one of you. And this is going to happen much quicker than even we talk about in the book, and I can explain why. And you're beginning to see the first vestiges. So, for example, you did your research to ask some questions, so forth. For me, the most interesting, just to do a plug for Google, if you haven't played with Notebook LM from Google, you should. It's analogous to what you described. You can take any form of multimedia and put it together. And it does, you can essentially ask queries. And the key thing is it's full multimedia. So it watches the videos, it listens to the podcasts, does the text, and you can do this. So if you have like a complicated thing, which almost everybody in this room is working on something complicated, put it all in Notebook and see how it can help you. The amusing part about it is has a thing where it can generate a podcast. And if you're confused as to why this is so funny, type Notebook LM not human. There's a podcast where the hosts are told that they're not human and see their reaction. And the thing that is remarkable is not that the voices are fantastic, but rather the entire discussion is generated fake, right? The query is the hosts have told you you're not human. And then it erects things like the man has a wife and the wife is unhappy with him, all the sort of narratives. Now, how does it come up with that? Well, remember, it's read every fiction. It's also read every nonfiction book, right? So it understands human narrative, human jokes, so forth and so on. These are just the beginning.
You're always good about predicting the next wave. So from your standpoint, what are the next wave of AI? We talk about agentic AI, the path towards AGI. So what is your sense of where all these trends are going now?
So one of the things that you're doing is you have an AI task force, and you're now going to do an AGI thing here, which obviously I'll be heavily involved with. And so here's roughly how it goes. The first thing I want to say very, very clearly is our society is not ready for this. The human systems, the governance, the rules, you're not ready for this arrival. And it's happening, it will happen much more quickly than you think. And I'll give you a timeline, which I'm now confident is correct. So last year's discussion is language to language. So you input something, it does this amazing thing, gives you an answer. Now, why is language important? Well, language turns out to have an awful lot of knowledge in it. Words have a great deal of meaning, especially in context. So you can cover an awful lot of things and concepts in human thinking about using language. So language is pretty impressive. The underlying technology is called next word prediction. Technically, what it's doing is it's looking back across millions of events, and it's looking back at the most recent set of words and saying, what's a reasonable next word? That's why it writes so well. It's sort of an amazing invention in and of itself. And the same is true for any multi-scale prediction problem: physics, biology, math, and programming. So right now, we're in a situation where you have very large context windows. Context windows are where you essentially have think of it as short-term memory. You basically say, the following things are true. Now, how long can a context window be? 1 million words. So you can feed it books and say, given these books are correct, do something. Most of us don't do that. We type 10 sentences, but that automation is important. The second one is the agentic revolution. Agents are systems where you have language in, it goes to a language model, the language model generates scenarios, the scenarios are evaluated, and then the agent is modified internally using a technique involving memory. So it essentially can learn stuff. So here's an example. The agent wakes up, it's in this room, and we say, turn on those lights and turn off those lights. Now, it has lots of dials. It doesn't know what they are, so it turns them on. Well, the first thing it does is it turns off the heating. Oh, that was an error. The second thing is it turns on the air conditioning. That's an error. Then it locks the doors. That was an error. Then it turns on the wrong lights. That's an error. Then it gets the right light. It says, good. And it has learned that. By the way, that all happens in a microsecond. It's not human learning. It's computer learning. So then it can learn something else and learn something else and so forth. And eventually it's the digital manager of everything in your life. So the point is, it only has to learn something one and then assemble it. Agents are important because you can concatenate them. They currently are designed to be language to language. So here's another example. I grew up in Northern Virginia. I happen to like it. I want to buy a farm in the outskirts of McLean. So I say to it, organize a farm, buy it in McLean, design me a 3-bedroom house, make sure everything's legal, don't spend more than X dollars. That's the command. So the agentic manager organizes the following. The first is it does a survey of what's available. The second is it consults the building code. It then decides the building code and this plot is available. It evaluates the quality of it. It then negotiates the price. It then finds an architect, looks at the architect's work, rejects their work, does its own design, proposes that, bids it out, and monitors the construction. Now you sit there and you go, wow, can it do that? It's easy. It's called workflow. Now, the example I used is characteristic of kind of everything that happens in a business. So businesses are essentially, there's something that happens, you have to respond, you have to deploy something, you have to calculate it, you have to bill somebody, you have to deliver a product, right? All of that gets automated through agents very quickly. There's a whole bunch of startups that are doing that. And the third one is generally known as text to code, and it's essentially generating programming. So today, the current models, if you say, write the code to do something, it can do a pretty good job, although they weren't trained on programming. So there's now a whole bunch of startups and likely very successful efforts to build automatic programmers. And I'll explain why this is so important in a minute. And there's also a bunch of people who are working on automatic math proving. Now, why would I focus on programming and math? Well, I've just said that these systems are next word prediction, and human language is immense, and thus we're also kind of running out of things to train against. But software, the verbs are relatively simple to learn, right? There are not that many verbs in any software language. This is what I do. And also there's a clear objective function. It either works or it doesn't. So write the code, test it, doesn't work, modify it, doesn't work, modify it, doesn't work, modify it, works, good, done. Move on. People believe that in the next year or two, you'll have super programmers. I'll come back to why this is important. The same turns out to be true of math. The math verbs are relatively simple, and you have an objective function. Does the proof work? And there's a technology which I and others have funded called Lean, which is an open source format for this kind of learning, which seems to be taking off. I was at a dinner last week on AI safety, and one of the mathematicians said, I think we'll have a super mathematician in 1 year. Okay, that's pretty aggressive. And super mathematician meaning a mathematician better than the best mathematicians. And the best mathematicians are incalculably hard to understand, right? So you can imagine what this thing is like. Why do I emphasize math and programming? Everything in our digital world starts with math and programming. So the path to AGI is you have these agents, and then you have these math and programming things, and then you start building AI scientists. So here's how it actually works. Let's say this is the slope of current progress, which is pretty good, by the way, right? Like OpenAI is now $190 billion. Look at the valuations. All of the stock market gains in the US appear to me to be completely a function of the AI craze across every sector. Everyone knows about NVIDIA. That's pretty good. So let's say you have 1,000 AI programmers, which Google certainly has, OpenAI has, Microsoft has, so forth. What happens when you release 1 million non-human AI people to work with the AI people? The slope changes, okay? How steep does it get? In my view, the company that gets to that, or the country that gets to that, will have a monopoly on innovation for some amount of time. Now, we can debate how long, and the same is true of countries. And the alert for this group, I want to say, is the Chinese have caught up. My last trip with Kissinger was to China, and my assessment at the time was that they were 2 years behind. They are now 6 months behind in 1 year because of incredible investment on their part. There's lots of evidence that they've evaded the sanctions, all the things that you could imagine that they would do. That's at least what the evidence is. But the important thing is they've caught up. I have one company I'm funding who's doing their training on Chinese models because they're better than American models. And I said, holy crap, that's like a big deal. And so it sure looks to me like we're now in a race, and this is my message to you all. We're now in a race between China and the United States for dominance in AGI. It's just beginning. It's crucial that we win. And here's why. In my world, if your slope is like this, you keep gaining. And then the second country, company, whatever comes in, it's doing it too, but this one is staying ahead. Now, what does this mean? Why would it matter? Well, what is a problem we have? Climate change, okay? What's another problem we have? We decide we want, let's say we're an adversary, we want to attack the American financial system. The system can design and detect zero-day exploits that have never been done before because it can invent them. What about material science, new batteries, new energy? Clearly it can do all of that. What about progress in quantum, something which we care a lot about? It can do all of that. If you go through the list of all of the stuff that we care about in a competitive market, we have to win this one. It's crucial for America that we win this one.
Thanks, Eric. If I Gemini'd, what was the most question you have received in the last 6 years since you were with AI Commission and now at SCSP was this whole competition between us and China. So I'm glad you answered it because it feels like every 6 months, 12 months, the dynamic changes. We're ahead, they're catching up, we're ahead. But what about our allies, Eric? I know you spent a lot of time in London and in Paris and in Asia. Where do they stand in
Here's what you have to, in order to win this battle, you have to have the following: an infinite amount of energy. These things, you cannot imagine the amount of energy these things take. You have to have a market which will give you $10 billion to build a data center without having any current customers, right? So you need a financial market and an energy market. You need access to the top chips, and you need to have all of these research scientists. In Europe, who are, close allies to America, they just don't have it. You can't just get that amount of power, that amount of money, that amount of people. You might be able to get it in India because the Indians are really, really smart. But again, they have their own challenges and so forth. China's out of the question. Russia's out of the question. Where else can you get that kind of scale? It's going to be us. And I'm sure that so one of the core questions is, what do they do? The most likely scenario is that these large foundation models, as they're known, and will be owned by proprietary companies in various ways, but they'll be licensed to partners. In our industry, there's a debate over open source for open weights technically and open and closed source. The technical question is, can you release the weights of one of these models and compete? Can that be misused and so forth? The Chinese have largely taken the 400 billion model, which is open weight, out of Llama, Meta, Facebook, and most of their gains have been in that area. So I used to think, which is like 3 months ago, that the big question would be proliferation of these open source models. Recently, DeepSeek, which is one of the Chinese companies, has produced its own models without using the Llama stuff, which is innovative and good and very powerful in what is called planning. So it sure looks to me like the Chinese competition can occur with or without open source. The danger of open source is that because we don't know what it's being used for, if you put guardrails in the open source, like these models know how to, so here's an example. The models know nuclear secrets, they know military secrets, they know weapons secrets, they know health secrets. All of those things are eliminated in the training done by the companies. And there's a voluntary agreement among the companies to implement those training regimes pretty much universally, which is why we're safe. So if you ask any of the models a sort of exciting question, it'll say, I can't answer that question. That includes things like copyright and things like that. It's relatively easy with open source to reverse those guardrails out. And that's the concern.
It's been almost 10 years there since Ash Carter asked you to help Department of Defense. First with Defense Innovation Board, then Congress asked you with the AI Commission. You moved from observing and criticizing to recommending action to now being involved, in analyzing and supporting the war in Ukraine. Can you tell us how this period has changed in your mind for the last 10 years? How is AI impacting now warfare? And just your personal experience in this journey.
So I had the privilege of working for the Secretary of Defense for many years, and spent a fair amount of time listening to their discussion about what is called the third offset, which the military people here in the room know the history here. It's essentially the arrival of precision weapons, the way to understand it. And the belief in the military is there's a next wave. Now, it's quite obvious to me what the next wave is. It's autonomy, 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 and inexpensive. And what does the U.S. military do? Not autonomous and very expensive. So the disconnect between what my community sees and what the military are doing is profound. So my favorite example is that we're building a 6th generation fighter. It's currently in the design process, human optional. Now these fighter jets last for 50 years. So do you really think in the year 2080, we're going to have humans in fighter jets in dogfights? By the way, the last dogfight for an American was in the 1970s. And the reason is because you don't have dogfights, you shoot precision missiles from aircraft over long distances, which is easily done by drone aircraft. So there's a fundamental problem in the conception of our national security and defense, which is we're not moving to autonomy, and inexpensive fast enough. Autonomy is, from your perspective, code for AI. So an example would be, talk about Ukraine for a minute. Ukraine is interesting aside from the fact that we as America should defend freedom, right? Freedom is, you have to fight for freedom. I'm sorry to say, I'm certainly not trying to encourage war. You have to fight for freedom. Otherwise you lose it. And Ukrainians are fighting for their freedom. So when the war started, Ukraine had no air force and no navy. So what do? They build sea drones, which cleared the Black Sea Fleet. They are technically, an example is called Sea Baby. They are essentially speedboats with rockets in the front and a navigation system. And based on the azimuth and the sea state, they can shoot a missile or rocket into the target, which is a Russian ship. The first time this happened, they sunk the ship. Second time, the helicopters came and destroyed those ships. So it turns out you need a whole bunch of those, but eventually enough of them will get through to destroy the ships. Ships are big targets. I know everyone likes ships. I happen to like big ships. Everyone likes aircraft carriers. They're very impressive. A single one of these autonomous drones that I'm describing, underwater drones, can destroy an aircraft carrier. This is like, we shouldn't be building more of them, I'm sorry to say. I know a lot of people like them, but I'd much rather have automated equivalent of aircraft carriers that are AI powered. In the Air Force, they didn't have an Air Force to speak of. They had a couple of jets which were kind of not working, and we didn't give them F-16s until a year into it. So they built drones. So the first phase of the war, basically the Russian tanks were coming in, and a simple rule is a $5,000 drone can kill a $5 million tank. Our tanks cost $30 million, by the way, so same is true there too. Tanks, I think, are largely over as a war weapon. And my idea was that in Ukraine, you'd see the end of artillery, mortars, and tanks. Today, artillery is still being used. Mortars are not really being used because they're not precise enough. Artillery is bad enough. And tanks are not being used except for APCs, armed personnel carriers. And the reason is that the drone collisions, if you will, the drones over the flot, as it's called, are so ubiquitous that you can't move. The drones have daytime cameras and nighttime cameras. They are not particularly automated. So part of my interest in this is to understand what happens when you add intelligence. So here's roughly how it works. You want persistent ISR, as it's called, which means you need drones, in this case, in the ground along whatever their contested line is. Let's assume they're always there. Current drones can last 12 hours. There are specific long-range drones that Ukrainians have built that can fly around for 12 hours, and they have very good cameras. The cameras are typically Japanese. They have 30 kilometers, 40 kilometers vision. They also have night vision, various radar things, and so forth. That allows you to see what's going on. And then you have other drones, which are attack drones, which carry a weapon. There are designs in Ukraine which are both an ISR drone and an attack drone, although I think that separation is probably makes sense, because the ISR drone is sort of sitting up there, whereas the attack drone is either a kamikaze drone or a return drone to get refilled. But the way the wars in the future land wars will be fought, is you have an automatically controlled ISR drones, and then you have drones that are killer drones, if you will, that are dispatched via action of the ISR drone, making the latency between target identification and the destruction of that target as in seconds. Remember, so this all sounds kind of straightforward. I just gave you the simple diagram. Let me tell you why it's hard. A little rule about war is the enemy gets a vote too. So today, for example, there are many drones that are not armed. They're dummy drones. How do you distinguish between the two of them? Another example is that the GPS is denied. When I say denied, I mean it's just like off and bad and so forth. Many of the American weapons at the beginning of the war would miss their targets because the Americans had been either stupidly built it this way, or they were required to build systems that use GPS navigation. First rule of war is GPS doesn't work. So you have to come up with a way of knowing where you are. There are techniques, but fundamentally you have to solve that problem. And the second one is that in this case, the Russian electronic warfare is the best in the world. And by that I mean the jammers, the suppression of signals, and so forth. So I've watched some of the missions, and what happens is, just to give you a stereotypical, it's in Kyiv, it's nighttime, it's like 9 o'clock, the soldier is drinking coffee with his screen, and he's running a war, in this case, south of Zaporizhzhia. So the drone takes off, and you can see the drone going along, it's perfectly fine, and then you begin to see the blocking, and in and out, and in and out. In this case, the drone eventually got to its target, but they kept trying to block it. So you can see when you watch the war, the drones, you can see with the DJI drones, for example, which they use ubiquitously, you can see the GPSs go from 20 to 0 when you get that. So you need a solution to blocking, but you have another problem. The systems are not automatic enough to hit the target without a human telling it where to go. So when they get close, you lose sight. Well, then you don't have confirmation that this is your target, and the rules of law say you actually have to know where the target is. You have to actually do this. You lose the signal, you have to come back. So you have to figure out a way to get through that. If America wants to win any next war, we have to collectively solve the problems I just described. And that learning is occurring in Ukraine because the U.S. is not allowed to be in Ukraine, and U.S. soldiers, which is a good idea, by the way, are not there. They're not seeing this. They're not watching the evolution and development of a new war. And that means that the transition from the old model to the new model in America will take much longer.
Thanks, Eric. I'm going to ask one quick question, and then I'm going to turn it over to the audience for a couple of questions, if you don't mind. We're in transition now. We will have an incoming president sworn in at the end of January. This podcast is called Memo to the President. What would be some of your advice for the new president, the areas we have to double down and accelerate, both on AI, but also given how you passionately talk about Ukraine and warfare, what would be some of the things you would say to the incoming administration they should do?
Thank God I don't have to be president. Imagine the situation where you have your president and you're trying to achieve some objective, and every single group is organized around its own special interests. And bureaucracies, the first thing bureaucracies do is they self-perpetuate. It's just a rule of bureaucracies. So I think you have to have some philosophies. I think the first has to do with, as a country, we need to help defend democracy. We need to fight for freedom. And I think that's pretty obvious. Now, that doesn't mean we have to fight, but we have to assist other people in the fight, which is why Ukraine is important. I think that there are many other examples. I'm just using that as the one I'm familiar with. And that specifically means providing the necessary assistance for them to hold the Russians back until there's some kind of a peace thing. What I have also learned in my wandering around the military is that as much as I would like to say defensive weapons are the correct answer, in fact, the way you win and the way deterrence works is you have to be able to win at offense. And the reason is offense can always overwhelm defenses with enough offense. I didn't understand that. So that's a learning for me. I think the second point goes back to this AI thing. Well, if you believe, as I do, that the arrival of this non-human intelligence is the single most important thing that will happen in our lifetimes, it is the creation of a new epoch of history, right? Because these things aren't going to stop. When we're all dead, they'll get smarter and smarter, and people will still be, our children and grandchildren will be dealing with these things. So winning the war in terms of leadership, winning here doesn't mean breaking them in the sense of China. It means being ahead of them, is crucial. I believe that the country should have a national initiative around getting there. Now, what would that a national initiative look like? We don't know. There have been a number of proposals, but it goes something like this. The majority of the developments will be in the private companies. They need things that the government has, starting with energy. The government needs things from the private companies, including knowledge of what they're doing, access, national security things, classified things, so forth and so on. There's a deal to be made, if I were Trump, with the tech companies, and I guess Elon will help here maybe, where it's basically access for energy, right? It's a good partnership, right? We all have the same goals. And there are a number of other tactics, including making sure that we have the world's top researchers and things like that.
Thanks, Eric. Turning over to you for any questions you might have, my friend.
Yes, go ahead. Ulata.
Ulata used to be Israel's national security.
Yes.
And of the things that you said resonate a lot, part of the book. I want to ask about the last thing you said and to tie it up to one of your first sentences, that governance isn't ready. I'm not sure access will be enough if there was no clear enough understanding of how to use this. And I'll ask if it so happens that the Chinese governance is more than access. They control progress. They can be number two, but if they're better in weaponizing those technologies, then being number one on the private sector might not be enough. So just, if you can elaborate a little bit more, you talked about energy and access. Will that be enough for the U.S. to lead the war?
Well, the American model is phenomenal, right? I mean, before we get too depressed about this, the innovation model of America is the darling of the whole world, right? Look at what we've achieved as a country, and thank you for partnering with us in all these amazing ways. Your model is also very impressive. I'm a big investor in Israel. So to me, America, it will be good if we get our act together on this. Now, what does it mean? China is likely to productize this technology much better than America because their costs are lower and they work harder. So an example would be in robotics. I worked a lot on robots for 20 years. The Chinese robots are now, in many cases, better, right? They're just better. I'm sorry, to be honest. So we have to have answers to each of these areas, and we have to win that. In the case of Israel, by the way, if you look at the horrific Hamas attack, had you had two kinds of drones, you would have been in a much better situation. The first drone is an ISR drone that has a bomb on it. The ISR drone sees the Hamas rocket taking off and destroys the target immediately. That would have helped. Another one would be tunnel clearing robots. In my talks with the military, and I'm sure you were in the military, so you must have an opinion about this. The notion of a human going into a tunnel is the scariest thing I can imagine as a human, right? I want the robot to do that. I want the drone to do that. And I think these techniques are relatively straightforward with a view of autonomy and ubiquity. And they would have really helped.
Thank you. Right.
Go ahead. Good to see you, Lynn.
Good to see you. Thank you. Thank you, Rod Barkoff from With Honor. The last time that I saw you in person was about a month before Secretary Kissinger passed away. It was shortly after the October 7th massacre. So it's been about a year. It's an extraordinary partnership that you had in creating your first book and now this one. How might he, over the last year, have challenged you in your thinking or advanced your thinking? What type of questions might he have asked over these last 12 months when so much has continued to happen in the world?
Well, Kissinger, was literally my best friend. He had a remarkable ability to put things in a historical context and see 2 moves or 3 moves ahead of me, and I think anybody else. So he was extremely concerned before his death, not that Ukraine would win, but that Russia would lose. Now, today that's not a conversation. And he was concerned because his view is that the Russia is fragile. I'm just saying what he believed. And that if they begin to lose in the various wacky parts of Russia that are not in Moscow and St. Peter's get sort of unruly, you can have internal civil wars, lack of control, things like that. So it's that kind of insight that I miss. If you look at Syria today, Syria fell, right? He spent a fair amount of time with the Shah of Iran, in the 1970s when he was Secretary of State. He would have a very interesting answer as to how to unify the Shia in a way that's friendly to us and keep them under some level of control with balance of power with the Sunnis. So that's the kind of insight that we're missing. All of us will benefit from that kind of insight.
Tammy, I know you always have questions.
Hi, Eric. I have a question about human in the loop and the Defense Department and our friends from Israel had so many tough decisions to make. But some of the reporting of the activities, military activities, said that there was an automation bias, that soldiers were making decisions about where to strike, how to strike, not just in Gaza, Israel, but in Ukraine, etc. And I just wanted you to address the whole idea of human in the loop and how do you train militaries? How do you educate people? Maybe, and what's the answer? And just like in the larger picture, because you've dealt with automation bias for a long time.
So I'll give you my favorite example. So you and I are the captains of a destroyer, and we've got a whole bunch of weapons and a radar. And the computer system says in 30 seconds, because we can't see it, a hypersonic missile is going to come and it's going to kill us. What would you like to do? Okay. 29, 28, 27. Press here to launch. Okay. How many people will not press that button like in about 2 seconds? So I think we have a problem that in real dire situations, people are going to shoot because they're going to trust. They have no other source. They can't see it. They have no other indication in the AI system, and that could lead to tragic outcomes. We saw this in the Cuban Missile Crisis. There were a couple of cases that are similar to that. The military is now using the term meaningful human control because the targeting of the weapons is so good now that basically the human authorizes it, but the weapon can go find the target and destroy the target. So I believe the way this will resolve itself is that the human has to take responsibility in a legal sense of what's going on and has to be competent enough to understand what can happen. And the system has to have enough safeguards to make sure the thing, for example, doesn't turn around and go the wrong way. I think that's how it's going to get resolved. I don't think you're going to, by treaty, reduce the accuracy or automatic targeting. Remember, these drones have fast enough processors and good enough imaging that autonomously they can do search and destroy. All right, so where is the boundary? You say, there's a tank over there, take that tank out. That's legal. What happens if there's a tank somewhere in this world? Go look for it, right? Where is that boundary? We haven't found that yet.
Thanks, Eric. Last question here.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Zviada Zime from Georgia, ISF fellow here, work on information warfare at the Fletcher School of Diplomacy. You mentioned Ukraine, and Georgians care about Ukraine. We have our own freedom fighting going on as a European.
You're also the victims of the most interesting cyber attacks in history.
Yes,
I'm second to that,
fortunately.
I'm sorry.
What I wonder is what Ukraine, as they have demonstrated some of the latest potential of warfare technology on the battlefield, can teach to the Americans or to the rest of the world, and how do you, as a second leg to it, how do you imagine as we see a big emergence of entrepreneurs in Ukraine and developers, and Ukraine, known for its human capacity in that field, how do you expect Ukraine to emerge as a new marketplace for development, and especially along the lines of those talents that you mentioned?
So in my most recent visit to Ukraine, and it's fun to take the train, and it's a great country. There are more than 600 drone startups in Ukraine, partly because if you're a man and you're in a drone startup, you're not being drafted into the war. So there may be oversupply of labor, which is a good thing. I'll give you two examples of two companies that are now growing quickly, profitable, raising money, Skyfall and Airlogics, both of whom make domestic drones that are quite powerful. They're in different segments of the market. Those are two of many that are likely to become exporters to, for example, NATO. And why would NATO buy it? They have no way of testing. They have no way of understanding what it really takes to do these things. So I think you will see, assuming Ukraine survives, a set of such things which will be available to the West. The Ukrainians are very clever with hardware. They're not very good, if I may say this, at huge volume. So, for example, they don't have assembly lines with PC boards and PC manufacturing that you would find, for example, in Asia. So they're dependent upon external things like that. And they're not particularly good in the higher functions of AI software. I think the military AI stuff is going to get built in America by the startups, many of which DIU and others are helping fund. So this is really important. When I talk to my friends who are in those startups, their problem is that their customer doesn't get why they're so important. But they're not allowed to sell to anybody except for the U.S. for obvious reasons. And the U.S. system is so slow, right? Now there's a group called Replicator, which is a project which is trying to solve this. These are infinitesimal compared to the $900 billion budget for the U.S. military. So one of the things that has to happen in the U.S. is we have to have some space to build these kinds of unmanned, uncrewed, the term is uncrewed weapons, which is sort of odd. Just call them drones.
Right. Eric, thank you. I know you have a hard stop. I want to thank you for dropping by.
Thank you all. And And I hope, I hope that you enjoy the books, and because we worked hard at it, and it is Henry's last book. He finished it on his deathbed. So he literally finished it about a week before he died. That's how committed he was to this. So in his honor, it's good. And the second thing is that we should talk about this AI task force we're putting together. We want to we collectively at SCSP, we want to drive this thinking throughout every aspect of the U.S. national security complex. And you all can help us, right? If you agree.
Thank you, Eric. And for those of you who have not RSVP'd, we have our holiday party tonight. Please come by. Thank you for your support. You have been friends and family of SCSP from day one. So happy holidays to everybody, and thanks again, Eric.